same way there's a lot of crazy Kraken, Linwood, Alex Jones type conspiracy stuff about the you know the
election,
Trump election, all that kind of stuff, and what went on. That takes it too far. There's a lot of stuff on the way about COVID that takes it too far as well. But there's still a lot of, I think most of it, on different kind of people with different social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, on YouTube and stuff. Different doctors who have spoken out have summarized the problems with the entire COVID situation and the narrative around COVID. That it's that it's not what people are being told it is, basically. Doesn't mean there isn't a virus, but it's primarily these people have a problem, and rightfully so, have a problem. Not just them, but a lot of people in most countries that are subjected to these restrictions, they have a problem with the restrictions, with the lockdowns.
Absolutely. There's protests going on everywhere.
And the ways in which the government is handling it. And it's not just that people are like, we don't like lockdowns, we're pissed off, let's have a protest. It's more that a lot of those people know, have data and have valid or solid arguments against the way the government has proceeded with handling this so-called, I shouldn't say so-called pandemic. I don't think it's a pandemic. I think it was an epidemic. I mean, calling it a pandemic probably isn't really accurate because it was very different in different countries. A pandemic is like, it's the way it's spun today anyway. It's global, it's worldwide. It's obviously very different in each country. So you have to look at each specific country, look at all the data for that country, and then decide whether it was an epidemic or not. And there's an argument to say that, yes, certainly there was an epidemic in a lot of countries. But calling it a pandemic just doesn't work, because there are certain countries that were virtually free of the virus, didn't have very little experience of it at all, and other countries that quickly got over it and it was gone, you know what I mean? So it's not a pandemic where it's like circling the world and having exactly the same effects or very similar effects on people all around the world. It's not true. So it's it's an epidemic in different countries, so yeah.
How? The thing I don't understand is we've got the dissenting views are so numerous and so highly qualified, many of them informally in government themselves. These people are not just lay people like ourselves who can look at the numbers and come to a rational point of view that is a counter-argument to the prevailing one. These people have clout. Some of them are in organizations like the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
That guy, Navarro, I think his name is, the British guy.
Yeah.
Pleading in December or November, pleading with national governments to stop the lockdown.
Stop using lockdowns,
This is not our policy from the World Health Organization.
Right.
So what are you doing? He's saying to them on TV.
Yeah.
And yet it persists.
Yeah, well, the genesis, I think, of the whole thing that they've kept going from the very beginning was the cause or the source of the problem was the very beginning was the hysteria that dominated back in March and April, or you could say it was, I don't know if it was deliberately produced or not, but it dominated most of Christendom, if you like to say it, most of the Western world, and most of the world, really. The hysteria around this being a deadly virus, I mean, remember at the very beginning, there were images of people dropping dead in the street in China and stuff, and that kind of stuff. And then they just went with it. Initially they weren't sure. And I think the most rational, I mean, for me, this is just my opinion, but it's backed up by a lot of early research into this virus that was done both in China and in Europe, that it did look rather strange to a lot of epidemiologists and biochemists who were looking at it initially. It looked strange to them. Now you can say that after the fact they realized that it wasn't man-made, but initially there were a lot of people who looked at it and put it out in published papers and made public statements that it didn't look natural, like a natural mutation of another coronavirus. And that
the French guy, the guy who got a Nobel Prize for cracking the AIDS virus, he was on TV here in France saying
Yeah.
Oh no, it must be man-made, and he
Yeah.
gave his reasons.
Right.
People in the studio were like, "What?"
Right. So so government, and people in government, health authorities, and their scientific advisors, all that kind of stuff, who probably knew that or came across that information, and assumed it was possibly true at the beginning, all freaked out because, of course, if you come across a virus that has been tinkered with, obviously tinkered with by human hands, the only hands that can really tinker with it, right? Then you're going to immediately go biowarfare.
At least as a possibility.
Yes, if you see that, so you're thinking you got to err on the side of caution and go full bore, biochemical attack response, and that seems to have been what happened initially. But then fairly quickly, and sure, maybe that didn't go away. Maybe some people in certain circles still are, fairly convinced that it was man-made. But once, especially with the experience in China and a lot of the work that the Chinese had done on it, they realized very quickly that it wasn't really a deadly pathogen. Even if it was man-made, it wasn't a deadly pathogen in the sense of, the Black Plague or even the Spanish flu or anything close to that.
Yeah.
They knew fairly quickly from Chinese studies that it was primarily a danger, a health risk, or a risk of a mortal risk to the same demographic that the flu is deadly to.
Yeah.
Which is primarily older people, people at or around the age of the normal life expectancy age, who, and also most importantly, who are in pretty bad health. So given that was known fairly early on, at least from, like I said, from China studies from the experience of the Chinese and what they had been saying, and then it was shown very quickly that was the people in Western countries who also were vulnerable to it. So at that point, then sure, it gets very complicated in terms of should they have modified their policies in terms of how they dealt with it. A lot of people have been saying all along that, well, in that case, isolate the vulnerable. If you really want to protect those people, isolate those people, the people who test positive for it, or who are not even the people who test positive for it, but rather the people who are vulnerable to it. Like isolate the very vulnerable, and sadly people in care homes, people with and in bad health, and people at home living in their own homes in bad health. Lock them down, basically. Give them lots of care, but leave the rest of the population alone because it's not dangerous to them. And in that sense, I mean, that's the single best argument that I haven't seen anybody really refute in any serious way or any meaningful way, is that the policy should always have been to isolate the people who are vulnerable and let natural herd immunity spread through the healthy population. And that's how you turn this virus into, make it join the ranks of the common cold, the other coronavirus that cause the common cold, or the flu virus. It very quickly becomes because the way it kind of works is when you get exposed to a virus, your immune system, all the different parts of your immune system, different cells that make up your immune system, and antibodies, etc., they basically break down a virus. They chop it up into many different pieces, and it's kind of constituent parts, recognizable parts. It's quite an intelligent. It's amazingly how intelligent it seems to be whenever you actually look into how your immune system works and how your body works in general. But your immune system chops it up into pieces, and then it's like a, what do you call those in a police lineup?
Yeah.
So it lines them up, and there are different cells that are part of your immune system, and look at all the different parts and memorize them and says, okay, got your number. And that's basically then how they recognize any part of that virus. Different parts of different cells in your immune system are able then to recognize not just that virus, but anytime it mutates, because any mutation that happens later on, and mutations do happen obviously in that virus, the mutations would only be quite small. There would only be small mutations in the virus. Small parts of the virus would change. In the genetic code would change only very slightly, leaving the rest of it the same as it was before, and meaning that your immune cells that recognized it would still recognize it, even if it only mutated a small amount, which they all only do. Mutate, generally speaking, only mutate a small amount. And also, when mutations happen, the mutations are usually deleterious. The kind of general direction that mutations go in for viruses is that it become more transmissible, but less deadly, less dangerous, less lethal, less good at doing the job that they set out to do, which is like, invade other cells. They become less able to do that, and that's how they then join like I said, the ranks of the normal seasonal flu-like viruses, colds and flu viruses. That any virus like that would come along, would join those ranks eventually after being subjected to this process of in the bodies of the majority of the population, where it's broken down, recognized, and then all those people get immunity to it. And once they get immunity to it, the next time they come in contact with it, the virus doesn't get a chance. Their immune system immediately recognizes and responds, and takes care of it very quickly. And because it's not reproducing in your body, because it's being killed off, you're not transmissible. You can't transmit it to anybody. So all those people who have been isolating because they're vulnerable can come back out of their homes as soon as that kind of herd immunity has been achieved. And this is 100-year-old science.
You just read the book to me. And they know this.
That's what they've been doing for 100 years. But for some reason, and I'm giving them an out in a certain sense, like I said, with initially they thought it was a man-made virus, and therefore possibly a bioweapon attack from somewhere, and they went crazy. But then it seems that for some reason they didn't stop with that extreme reaction and kept it going, and have kept it going for 9 months now, more than 9 months.
Yeah,
and of course that has had a very bad effect on hospitals. That kind of hysteria they've allowed to continue has had a bad effect on the healthcare system
as a whole, not just dealing with this.
Right, because it's still being presented as this deadly virus to everybody, when it's not deadly to everybody. It's only, like I said, it's only deadly, only a danger to a very small percentage of the population. But you have, from March and April, you've had hospitals being kind of, a lot of staff being sent home.
To protect them from contracting.
To protect the staff from getting it, and also protect anybody in the hospital from, basically stop the transmission. Part of it, like in the same way people were told to lock down and self-isolate, not see their friends and family and stuff like that. A similar policy was instituted in hospitals to the greatest extent possible, in order to stop the contact between members of the hospital staff and patients and stuff, in the belief that this was something that was just going to, sweep through the community. Back in April and May, they sent en masse large numbers of people in the UK and in other countries, in Spain and France and the US and pretty much all the countries concerned. They sent elderly people who were in hospital for whatever illness they had back to their care homes or their residential homes. And they said explicitly, in anticipation of a wave of COVID patients, people coming down with serious COVID symptoms of all ages. That's why they set up they call them the Nightingale hospitals in the UK. They repurposed a conference centre and put like 500 beds in it, with it possibly for like 5,000 or something like that. And there were several of those in the US as well, and several of them around the UK. And
the ship in New York Harbour?
The ship in New York Harbour, and it never came. And the bizarre thing is that they knew at that stage that it was not going to come, that there was not going to be large numbers of young people or people of all ages who were going to come down with this. And that was proven. So that's one thing they did. And as a result of that, what happened was they emptied hospitals of elderly people who were frail and in need of healthcare, in anticipation of having to treat a lot of young people. And obviously, young people, from the government's point of view, young people are more important than older people. Older people, from a government statistician point of view, they're dry tinder. They're going to burn up any time now anyway. So there's no point in spending too much resources on them. So they send them back home.
And they don't generate tax.
Right, but at the very least, those people do get healthcare while they're still alive. But in this case, because of the hysteria, they got no healthcare because they were sent back home, and because it was COVID, a pandemic, a viral virus, circulating around, they had to be isolated. They had to be left alone. And if we go back to the list there, Scotty, there's one that you just had up there. Well, there's that part, but one of those, 24,000. Those two actually. What's the first one there? 2020. Okay, not that one. So go to the next one and the following one. That one, 40,000 extra deaths at home in England and Wales since the pandemic began. Now, if you scroll down a little bit, it says right there in the second paragraph, I think, or is it the first paragraph? Of this number, third paragraph, of this number, so 40,000 plus, of this number, just 3,881 were deaths directly involving COVID-19. So there were 40,000 excess deaths in care homes, extra deaths compared to the average over the past number of years. This year, and primarily in, not just in March, April, and May, but throughout the year. But there was obviously a spike in March and April, but it continued on. But a lot of those deaths, were as a result of that hysterical move at the beginning to throw people, all of these people who died in their homes and in care homes, out of hospital where they were getting treated and needed ongoing treatment, and they sent them home and left them there. And to the point where the doctors wouldn't even go near them because they were afraid of giving them COVID. Or spreading COVID or whatever. They basically were left on their own in care homes and in the residential homes, and a lot of them, as you can see, 40,000 of them died. Go back to the article, sorry again, Scotty. I mean, that's there's 24,000 excess in care home deaths, and then the first one just before that was 40,000 deaths. Yeah. Oh, sorry, what was the other one? The first one, maybe. Yeah, 40,000 extra deaths at home. So this is specifically in residential houses, and the other one was 40,000 in residential houses, of which 37,000 were not COVID related, and 24,000 in care homes that were not COVID related. Because if you go, there's one there that begins with BMJ. That one, yeah, that's from earlier this year, and that's the British Medical Journal, which is based in Cambridge University in England, and only a third of the excess deaths seen in the community in England. This is in the community in England and Wales can be explained by COVID-19. New data have shown. At the bottom there, at a briefing hosted by the science media, that one right there. This is David Spiegelhalter, who's a very famous kind of statistician in the UK. Explained that over the past 5 weeks, that's from sometime in May, care homes and other community settings had to deal with a staggering burden of 30,000 more deaths than would normally be expected, as patients were moved out of hospitals that were anticipating high demand for beds. Of those 30,000, only 10,000 had COVID specified on the death certificate. So that's 20,000. That's similar to the other 24. So there you have 40,000 excess deaths, non-COVID related in homes, and you have 24,000, because that other article is bit more updated. That's a total of 64,000 excess deaths this year, and probably more by now because those are a few months old. That data, there's probably more. But then what I can't understand is that the only conclusion I can draw, the conclusion I have to draw, is that the official stats show that this year, because now they have them because we're into a new year. For last year, this is in the UK, there were 90,000 excess deaths compared to what would be expected or from the average over the past few years. So 90,000 excess deaths is their total for last year. And of those, we've seen in the articles I just gave you, 64,000 were not COVID related, but lockdown related or lockdown effects related, not just lockdown in the sense of lockdown and the effects it has on the healthcare system and the cure, and providing primary healthcare to vulnerable people. Yeah. So
it's as if the cure is worse than the disease.
Yeah. But what I can't understand is how they don't see this, and why they continue on. Maybe you could say that they made a big mistake. They messed up big time and they're trying to ease themselves out of it now and hope it goes away, basically hope that nobody notices. But the data's all there.
Politically, we're in too deep now. We have to ease ourselves out of it. But they don't seem to be easing themselves. We'll see yet. That's why I was wondering, with Trump gone and the old order restored, normality, as certain people see it, restored, maybe now there'll be some backing away from it.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
Cautiously. Of course, they're never going to admit to having done anything fatally wrong. I've seen some.
I mean,
there's been some contrition. Well, come on, hang on. We didn't know. There've been, op-eds in mainstream papers and where yes, that was wrong. This was wrong. But we didn't know because it was a global pandemic and there was panic everywhere. And you can almost, I can give them a bit of an out. Not a complete out per se, but I can at least see where the scales weigh up. Because if you have a panic population and it's of no doing of your own as a government, it's because they're hearing from international media about a situation. Your population is spooked already. You have to at least look like you're taking this seriously. Yeah. I mean, there have been countries where they didn't take any of this seriously and they had consequences. The one that comes to mind is Belarus last summer. Now, it's complex because Belarus was probably subject to foreign interference. They certainly claimed that, the president there, Lukashenko. But when you get foreign interference, it can only amplify something that's already current in a population. And it was interesting that in the hundreds of thousands of people who did protest against their election last summer, you could see many of them were wearing masks on the streets. This is a population that was explicitly told the opposite. Don't wear masks.
Right.
Don't mind any of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's foreign shenanigans going on. Mm-hmm. Lukashenko more or less said it's a scamdemic or it's a fake pandemic, etc. But much of his population responded not to him. They went with the appearance of what was going on internationally. Mm-hmm. And so when they protested, they were wearing the hygienic masks. Mm-hmm. They weren't exactly social distancing because they were thronging the streets.
Right.
But they were signaling that they were taking this much more seriously than their own government.
Yeah.
So I suppose the point I'm making is that it's kind of, you're between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
It's to some extent, if you're in government or media or some position of responsibility, mm-hmm. and the cat is already out of the bag, even if that cat is actually just a cute little kitty, presents no real danger or threat to anyone.
Yeah,
it's already given the impression of being the Black Death.
Yeah.
So they're acting on that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, there is a narrative, but it's like I said, it goes back to the hysteria that was promoted and was put out there. And I have questions over whether or not whether the governments actually knew that. I think they did. The data was there. I know they should have known. Let's say at the very least, they should have known that the hysteria was unwarranted, and all the policies they put in place as a result of that hysteria about it being a deadly pandemic to everybody has caused so much suffering and so many deaths, so many unnecessary deaths. But if you just go back to the list there, Scotty, just scroll. Give me that one. Yeah, that one, for example, this is in Northern Ireland. 2,700 Northern Ireland health workers are self-isolating. Now, those are 2,700 health workers, i.e. nurses, doctors, GPs, everything, are not available in Northern Ireland, which isn't a big place.
Population 1.5
million. Because they're self-isolating because they've had a PCR test. That has these, that they put through, dozens of cycles to the point where it'll pick up anything, and they're very unreliable. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff on the PCR test being unreliable, and most people who have a positive PCR test have very mild or no symptoms whatsoever, and if they have no symptoms, they're not contagious. They're not transmitting anything to anybody else. Just go back again, Scotty. Keep it on that list. Yeah. So, and then scroll along. Another example is that we can get into. Well, so they messed up the healthcare system basically by throwing people out of hospitals and also throwing the staff out of hospitals. And then when you hear that, do you have one there called? I think you do. No, maybe you don't have this link. The Derry Journal. No. Let me give you this one to put up. This one kind of piqued my interest. It's from October this year, and it's from a city in Northern Ireland called Derry. And it's a doctor saying that the hospital was like a war zone with COVID patients. And this is in, and he goes on to say, blah, 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 that this was in October last year, and that it was like a war zone. This is the headline of the article, is like a war zone, right? So I thought, well, I can actually find the data for that hospital. Well, I can ask for the data. So it was a Freedom of Information request. I asked for the data for admissions, i.e. how many patients were in the hospital. I wanted to know for that month to see if it was true that it was like a war zone. The hospital would have been falling out the windows, right? It would have
inundated with
overflowing.
people.
But if you go to the PDF, Scotty, on the pop-up, I don't know if you have it open to you. Yeah, so there's the Freedom. It's the Western Health and Social Care Trust, and that's my request. I just wanted accurate data on the number of monthly admissions to Altnagelvin. That's the hospital Derry during the period. I wanted the past 4 years, basically 2017 and 2020. And so they just recorded that and scrolled down. Yeah, keep going. Keep going. So there you have 2017, 18, 19, and 20 in the admissions. And if you look at the total for the year down the bottom to give you an idea, 2020 compared to previous years, it's overall, it's about 30% less. 2020 admissions plus day cases compared to the previous 3 years. And if you go specifically to October, just on that 2020 admissions, for example, in October there, you see that it's 1810, which again is about 30% less. You go across there, you see over 2,000 for all of the others, or almost 2,000 in, pretty much over 2,000 for all of the others. So it's about 30% overall down in that month of October for that hospital.
So why would the doctor?
So why was he saying it's a war zone? It can't be. Well, this is part of the problem. What they did, because of their hysteria around this virus, still believing in October this year, and still to this day believing that it's something that is deadly to a large number of a big spread of the population, including young people, children, everybody, that they're all going to be the walking dead coming into hospitals. They, since March and April at the beginning, they set up, they emptied a lot of hospitals in a certain sense. Well, they emptied them of patients and removed a lot of staff as well, especially when they started testing them. And if they tested positive, then they had to stay at home so they didn't transmit it. But they designated certain hospitals, and this happened across the world, across the Western world in particular. They designated certain hospitals as COVID centres. And all of anybody who had anything that could be called a COVID symptoms, serious COVID symptoms, were sent to that one hospital. And not just to that one hospital, but to only one section of that hospital. And the rest of them were essentially empty of COVID patients because,
desolated.
And this is part of the planning, right? The pandemic, so-called supposed pandemic planning to stop the spread of it was you just isolate you make one hospital the center for COVID patients, and you tell, well, yeah, they don't necessarily tell people to not go to hospital for other things, but people didn't go to hospital. This is something that's very well known as well, because you had various different government ministers at a certain point in May and June telling people, listen, go to hospital if you need to, because the vast majority of the population who would have otherwise gone to hospital for various treatments, people, either cancer patients or people who had various symptoms or illnesses that needed ongoing care or needed tests for certain things, they didn't go because they were afraid, because of the hysteria. So
they
that's
were
why
afraid
hospitals
to get it themselves.
They're afraid to get,
but they also thought they were doing their part
as well.
They didn't
protect
want
the
to.
system.
I just have something. I'll stay at home
right.
and work it off myself.
Right.
When in fact many of them should have gone, because now, how many stories have we heard where
right.
people finding out 6 months later they missed a cancer screening?
Yeah. Well, we'll look.
Now they have cancer.
We'll look at that in a second. But they, they didn't. People didn't go to hospital. So that's why you had a lot of these people going around hospitals. You might have seen them on the web. Various people with cameras going to hospital and saying, "Where's the pandemic? This hospital's empty." They're walking around an empty hospital. That's because they haven't gone to the one in their area, the one hospital that is the designated COVID center, and that's the hospital that this doctor in Derry is talking about. Where one section of that hospital that had very few patients compared to previous years. but he was describing it as a war zone, because what he's describing is one section of the hospital where they have stuffed all of the people that they believed had COVID symptoms into that one area, and they weren't allowed to put them anywhere else in the hospital, because they still had a few people in other parts of the hospital to contain the spread of the virus. They had to concentrate them in one area of the hospital, and that part of the hospital was overflowing and like a war zone. And the point is, it's arguably it was all unnecessary, because the primary, the most important factor about all of this is that, and that has been known even before March, like I said, from the Chinese experience and then through experience in Western countries after that, very quickly in March and April, that it was not a danger to the vast majority of the population. I'm talking about 96, 97% of the population that doesn't fall into that category of elderly with long-term underlying health conditions. There's only a very small percentage of the population who are seriously ill in that way, and they're the people who, like I said before, should have been isolated and all that kind of stuff. And so none of these policies were necessary, If you just go, Scotty, just to flesh out that point, there's Italy, the one in Italy, 99%, over 99% of coronavirus patients in Italy who died had other health problems.
Yeah, that was reported months ago.
The response, and that's the same case in the US. It was 94% in the US from the CDC. In the UK, it's something like 94%. In Spain, about the same. It's all in the mid to high 90s. The patients all were elderly, and most of them elderly, but some of them slightly younger. But all of them, almost all of them, 95+%, had serious long-term underlying health conditions. And like I said, most of them at or above the normal life expectancy. These are the people that the governments never really cared about before, that they didn't care when they died. Of course, the counter to that point is that, well, are you saying that those people they deserve just to be left to die if there's a new respiratory virus going around? And the answer is no. They should be given care, obviously, but as I said previously, they weren't at the very beginning. They were not being given care. They were being denied primary health care by being dumped out of hospitals in expectation of large numbers of young people coming in, which was, like I keep saying, was pretty well discernible or known early on that was not going to happen. There was not going to be a wave of people of all ages coming into hospitals. It was only this demographic. So the fact that 99 or 95% of the population have underlying health conditions, serious underlying health conditions, and are very old, it should inform your policy. You know what I mean? In terms of how you look at this virus. I mean, you should not see it as something that just, cuts a swathe through the entire population and indiscriminately killing young and old. It's the same. Like I keep saying, it's the same. It poses the same danger to the same demographic as other seasonal respiratory viruses. And there's also, the most common comorbidities observed in coronavirus, big one there is hypertension, i.e. that's high blood pressure. And people think high blood pressure is a normal thing, but high blood pressure is serious when it's really chronic high blood pressure. It's like an inflammation of all of your vascular system, basically. It's kind of systemic inflammation, and it's really bad when you get, it's like really highly correlated with severe illness or death with, if you have hypertension and
a virus
viral respiratory viruses in particular. But other, like type 2 diabetes, very high as well, heart disease. So these are all people with chronic renal failure. These are all people who have this before they get the virus, right?
Yeah.
And the virus it just makes it too difficult for them to push through it, and they die. And that's what happens all the time, every year, and nobody ever really cared very much about it before. Just go to the next one, Scotty. That's okay, not that one. And here, I just got this today, actually. It's just the latest from the National Health Service in England. I posted this frequently on my Facebook page every time they release it, but it's their data on COVID-19 deaths by age group and pre-existing condition. And you see there that of the total number of deaths that they say was from COVID, I suppose they describe it as 58,000. 56,000 had pre-existing conditions, and only 2,446 did not have pre-existing conditions. So that's a large majority. It's up in the high 90% of people who, again, it mirrors what we've known from Italy and Spain and everywhere else. And if you just go to the next one of those, it shows, again, it's not just from the same National Health Service in England website, the type of pre-existing condition. So they're even saying here, COVID-19 deaths by type of pre-existing condition. Asthma, chronic kidney disease, same things, chronic neurological disorder. But interestingly, I mean, it's been known as well, dementia, chronic pulmonary disease. So the thing is, they say that COVID causes chronic pulmonary disease or causes, acute respiratory disease, which is probably not that different from chronic pulmonary disease. But these people, are dying from COVID, supposedly, and COVID is obviously just coronavirus disease, and the symptoms of that disease are all of those things that those people already had.
Yeah.
And that ultimately, very likely, given that they're all, the majority of them are in their 80s, that they're going to die of that relatively soon anyway. And that's not being, insensitive. I'm just saying that those people have a very short expected lifespan.
Yeah.
When you're 84 and you have long-term kidney disease or chronic pulmonary disease or long-term hypertension or chronic diabetes, and you're in your 80s, you don't have a long life expectancy anyway.
Yeah.
And like I keep saying, those are the people who have been dying supposedly as a result of or from this virus. It hasn't been healthy young people. Sure, you can pull out some statistics and stuff and show that there have been young people who have died from it, etc. And the media made sure to inform everybody of that repeatedly when it happened. But I can equally show you media reports that hardly anybody knew about or heard about from previous years of young people, 14-year-olds, 26-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, perfect health dying from the flu. One article I was looking at had a list of 12 people in the UK that they just picked from a particular year, a few years ago, they reported on it, the Daily Mail it was, that they had all died from the flu. And so that's not, the fact that some young people die from this particular virus is not unique to this virus. That happens with the other seasonal flu-like illnesses or viruses as well. Yeah.
I remember when we started looking at the comparative flu numbers when this started last year. At first we were like, okay, hang on a second. The case to fatality ratio, that's the key figure, because people want to have an idea of how many are dying once they've caught something. Then we can decide whether or not to panic, do something, or just, tell people to calm down. It became apparent right away that was not an easy thing to do, because comparing previous winter flu seasons with SARS-CoV-2 cycle of cases going up and how many were dying with it was very difficult, because so many assumptions went into the earlier statistics about what constituted a death from a strain of influenza.
Right.
For example, in the very latest stat you have from the NHS in the UK, that number of 54,000 are dead from COVID. But in one table, and then in the other table they explained that 52,000 the vast majority had at least one comorbidity.
Most of them had 2 or 3.
That contains in it an assumption for the middle table. The middle table says, strictly speaking, only 2,000 and something people in the United Kingdom
actually died from
COVID.
Yeah.
But that contains the mother of all assumptions, which is that the health system is 100% perfect, and it knows exactly what health status every single living being within the system is at. Because I would say to you, what if, this is a reasonable thing to ask, I think, what if those 2,000 people for whom we don't know which, if any, they seem to just drop dead. They got the virus and actually dropped dead, like those videos from China. But I would say to you, no, the health system is not perfect. Mm-hmm. We don't know that they did not, in fact, have underlying issues for which the virus came along and knocked them out.
Absolutely.
And the same goes for the the years in the past. Did someone really die from the flu? They were young. There was no apparent problem. They had been at a rugby match the day before. They were in top health, it seemed. No one ever did autopsies.
No. They never
on
bothered.
those people to find out.
They never cared before. So somebody really wanted to know. It got really interested in this virus in particular. And that brings me back to the claims at the beginning by reputable, known world-class epidemiologists who said that this virus showed signs of not being natural. Of course, others came out and said, no, that's false, all that kind of stuff. But still, that point was made by respectable, knowledgeable people.
Yeah.
And that would, suggest to me that would go some way to explain why they have such an interest in analysing this particular virus up the wazoo. And as you were just saying, they never cared about previous. There's been new strains, new mutations of flu viruses fairly regularly, but they never cared about them in the past. And in 2017-18, the winter of 2017-18, for that year of 2018, maybe it was 2017, one or the other, the UK reported an estimated 50,000 excess deaths from the flu. They estimated it, but they didn't care. They just reported, there you go, 50,000 excess deaths. This year, the official data there that you saw is the upper 50s or around 60,000 deaths from this particular virus in this past year, since March even, so it's not the full year. So, there's something strange about the response to this virus that can't be explained.
It's phenomenal.
Based on the effects of this virus on the population. It's like we've just explained. It follows a similar pattern to other seasonal respiratory viruses in terms of who it's dangerous to, and the government never cared about other seasonal respiratory illnesses or viruses that cause respiratory illnesses. They never cared before, even when the estimated deaths in previous years was similar to the claimed deaths from this virus this year. They never cared, and this year they really, really cared a lot. So that's the big question. Why care so much when there isn't that much different? And you knew from early on that it wasn't that much different from other similar coronaviruses. Why the intense interest in this virus to the point we are vaccinating, we are testing it, trying to test the entire population, and you're developing. Well, we know possibly why vaccines are developed. I mean, obviously, vaccines are developed. Let me just say it for the record: vaccines are developed by vaccine manufacturers to, generally speaking, to improve people's health and stop them dying from deadly viruses. But there's also another angle where big pharma and vaccine makers, make a lot of money from them as well. So there's a financial motivation. I don't think I don't think it's rude to say that, right?
Will this thing finally lift?
Well, yeah, but I mean, of course, the obvious explanation for that is that it's the vaccines which have been rolled out, are being rolled out. So if they want to, turn down the dial on the COVID lockdowns, et cetera, then they can do that using the vaccines as an explanation for why they can do it now. I mean, they're making sounds about that already in the UK. They're talking about sometime in March they're going to be able to, the foreign minister, I think, said that in March they hope they'll be able to start to wind down the lockdowns and stuff, and there's a lot less, they're still talking about it now, but that's the kind of, obviously, and this isn't a conspiracy theory. I mean, it's it was in SAGE, the British government kind of emergency group on that directs national emergencies and that kind of stuff, that took control of it during the first pandemic in March and stuff.
Orwellian.
SAGE, I know, yeah. I'm not on SAGE about them at all.
The wise elders.
SAGE in a creepy way, but they published, minutes of their meetings where they talked about, exaggerating things in order to encourage compliance among the population. And the same is true for vaccines, because the government sees the vaccines as it's their responsibility to get the vaccines out there. So nobody, any rational person would accept the likelihood that the government, especially at this time during a vaccine rollout, is, maybe increasing the propaganda, increasing the messaging, let's say, in the media, in order to increase the vaccine uptake, because they know there's a resistance among the population, a decent section, depending on the country, a decent section of the population to getting vaccines. So you want to hype hype the emotional messaging in order to get as many people as possible to take up basically fear, spread as much fear as possible in a certain sense.
The British media has
In order to get as many people to take the vaccine.
Yeah, they have all kinds of figures. Everyone above 18, everyone by June.
Yeah, well,
vaccinated.
We'll see. They're running
by mid-February, 15 million.
Maybe they're running into some problems with the Pfizer vaccine. Right now, particularly that's the mRNA vaccine, the one that.
Is this the one where 24 people, their deaths are associated with it?
32 in Norway. Yeah, 32 in Norway.
And that's not conjecture. That's what's been reported.
That's the Norwegian government said that. Norwegian Health Authority said that. So yeah, so they're wondering if they should stop. Well, they've basically said most of it's been people 75 and older, and maybe with some health conditions, not sure. And so they're saying maybe it's a good idea not to give those mRNA vaccines, the new ones that haven't really been tested on a wide population before and are a different technology from normal vaccines. That those you shouldn't be giving those to elderly people who are in frail health, basically, because they seem to be dying in significant numbers. And actually, the numbers are significant because in 30, I think it's about 32 people in Norway, and the number of people they had vaccinated was about 30,000. So the death rate from the vaccine, from that mRNA vaccine, as far as it's gone so far, on 300,000 people, 30,000 people and 30 deaths, is 1 in 1,000, which is a death rate of 0.1%, which is similar to the death rate from the virus.
Right.
So you can take your chances. A logical conclusion from that would be that, especially people who are 75 years and older, that their chances of dying from the virus are the same as dying from the vaccine. That's official statistics. YouTube can't censor us for this, because this is, you can go and look at the Norwegian Health Ministry's website and do the numbers yourself. And that's also at 0.1% death rate at this point from that Pfizer vaccine is 10,000 times greater than the death rate from the flu vaccine. Because the flu vaccine has a death rate of about 1 in
100,000 or something.
No, it's 10,000 times greater, so it's about 1 in 10 million people officially die from as a result of getting the flu vaccine. So 10,000 times, a 10,000 times higher death rate from this vaccine than from the flu vaccine. So yeah, there's something very strange about the whole thing, and it's not being. A lot of people are talking about it, but it's not being discussed in the mainstream. Really, the media is falling down on the job yet again, as they have done many times before. It's
incredible. They're falling down the job. There's an enormous gulf in information that's just begging to be filled. And of course, what it's getting filled with is often the most crazy stuff.
Right.
Understandably, there's a vacuum there. People are asking questions. Yeah. It's been going on a year now, because it goes back past March. It was this week last year that it was really starting to spread from China. Panic about it,
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just look at my list there again, Scotty, of my wonderful tabs. Yeah, that's the thingy. What's the last one? Did that one. Go back. Oh, you can go through. Yeah. Most excess deaths. Is that... Scroll down. Yeah. So that's the one that says 91,000 more than the average in 5 previous years. Right? That's interesting, because I just showed this the data from the NHS in England, which shows that their total is the upper 50,000, 58,000 or something dead from coronavirus, with only 2,000 actually not having
a known identified comorbidity.
Yeah. So, but there's a shortfall then in that between their about 60,000 from the official data from the NHS and this other source, wherever they got their source from, wherever they got their data from, total excess deaths is 91,000. So only 60 have had a PCR test before they died. You could say that the other 30,000 are people who died
they're assumed deaths or something.
Well, that's 60,000 are people who died. You could claim if you wanted to hype the coronavirus threat, you could say that those 30,000 people just are people who didn't have a PCR test, right? So the total number is 90,000, but NHS England only recognises 60,000 because they're only the ones who have had a PCR test. That's how they define a COVID death if they have tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 via PCR test. But as we talked about earlier in the show, that total of 90,000, this causes a problem here. It's a bit of a conundrum. Maybe somebody else can figure it out. But of those 90,000 excess deaths official for last year, with 60,000 of them having had people who had a positive PCR test before they died, there's that figure we came up with from other mainstream sources of 40,000 excess deaths in residential homes and 24,000 in care homes that did not have, were not associated with COVID. So you can put those two together because that gives you a total of 155,000. Obviously it's the same figures, but one group is saying that of the 90,000 excess deaths, 60,000 of them had a PCR test, positive PCR test, and therefore are COVID deaths. But there's other data saying that 64,000 of those 91,000, because 91,000 is the total excess deaths, 64,000 of them were not COVID related.
Okay.
So there's obviously some maneuvering going on here with data and claims of COVID deaths and what is a COVID death and what isn't a COVID death. And do they have COVID on their death certificate? Do they not have COVID on their death certificate? Did they have a PCR test? Does the PCR test matter if someone's in hospital and they've had long-term chronic kidney failure and they're 85 years old? Is someone looking at that and saying, well, they obviously didn't die from COVID, right? They came to hospital and their kidneys failed and they had a positive PCR test, but I'm not putting that down as COVID because their primary health condition was kidney failure and they died of kidney failure. And the PCR test doesn't mean that they died of COVID. The PCR test at 45 cycles, like we were saying, will pick up anything.
Yeah.
You'll find a tiny remnant of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in a person like that's body. But how can you justifiably claim that that's a COVID death when all you've done through a PCR test is find a tiny bit of the virus in their body? Did they have any symptoms of COVID? Or when they were admitted to hospital, as they had been multiple times over the past 10 years with chronic kidney failure, and then finally succumbed to it, was it chronic kidney failure that killed them?
Yeah.
Make a judgment there, but you know what the side is. You know what the reasonable one would be.
Yeah. Well, for someone to want to write a headline like that, more deaths in 2020 than what in any year since World War II.
Yeah. Well, they say that, and then they say, actually, it's not really since World War II, because if you adjust it for age and population and various different other parameters, it's actually only the worst since 2003. But that headline is an example of the media, of yellow journalism, hyping stuff up to get clicks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They got to do that, and people a lot of people aren't aware enough of that, and they need to keep that in mind all the time, that the media does that kind of thing specifically to make money, to get you to read their website. Because when you read their website, when you click on that hysterical, exaggerated, sensationalist title, as soon as you click on that website, they're getting money because there's ads popping up in front of your face as well, So, and that's the same with that Derry hospital one. The title of it was "Hospital was like a war zone," says Derry doctor. But then you go down and read in the article, and he says actually no. He says it was
one
specifically
unit.
Says in the COVID center that was, but then by reading that leads you into lots more questions. Like, okay, especially if you have the data that I got from the Freedom of Information request showing that there were a lot less people in the hospital than there has been in the previous 3 years during that time when he said it was like a war zone. And you say, okay, so it was his COVID centre that was a war zone. But the hospital was relatively empty, 30% down on admissions, so it was relatively empty, the rest of the hospital. So why did the writers of the article say that the hospital was like a war zone? Because that then conveys to the reader that this hospital is overflowing. And you know what's going to happen to people who need to go to that hospital?
They won't go.
They're not going to go. They're not going to go for their cancer screenings. They're not going to go if they feel a pain in their chest. And they're going to die at home. They're going to be added to that statistic of the rising number of 40,000 so far of people who just died, excess number of people who died in their homes compared to last year. Heart disease. There's another one I got there, Scotty. The percentage of increase in, it's up something like 50% increase in heart attacks and coronary deaths from heart disease.
Yeah.
And cancer deaths up a similar amount. In women, breast cancer up a similar 50-60%. Dementia deaths up 50-60%. Compared to the average over the past 5 years. So, and in most countries, you look at the data, that's the same across those countries, because all of these countries follow these same policies, these hysterical, really, counterproductive and destructive policies in terms of what they did to the population, what they did to the healthcare system, and caused the same excess deaths unnecessarily by essentially depriving, as a result of it, all the end result is you deprived people in one way or another of primary healthcare, people who needed it. So of course, I mean, they cancel cancer screenings, they're cancelling elective surgeries, they're cancelling all these things. Not only are the hospitals cancelling people, turning them away, but also, as we were just saying, when people read headlines like this, yellow journalism headlines, they're scared because they hear hospitals like war zone. I'm not going there because, well, it's
who wants to be in a war zone?
Not just a war zone, but it's full of COVID or something, right? So I'm not going there, and I'm just going to stay at home, and I'm not going to get the treatment I need, and I'm going to die. And those people didn't have COVID. They're isolated in their homes and have been for a long time. They're not contracting any virus. They're dying from not receiving primary health care because of a hysterical government response to a virus that was known from the very beginning was not very much different from a normal seasonal flu-like virus. And the question is, why did they have that hysterical response? And the only thing I can think of is at the beginning, at least at the beginning, they were convinced that it was not natural. And they put in place these extreme measures of locking the entire population down. But then when they realized that it was not, while it may have been man-made, it was not deadly to the vast majority of the population. It wasn't even dangerous to the vast majority of the population. And they should have cut out those measures. They should have quickly rolled those measures up and put them away and let things go back to normal and start providing primary health care to the population, stop scaring them and encourage them to get back out and live their normal lives and to take care of themselves. But they didn't do that. So why would governments decide not to do that? Did they decide they were on a good thing and wanted to have some more fun?
This is the question for now. I won't even attempt to answer it because the show's running on, but this thing it's picked up steam, and it's got its own momentum now. People talking about new normals, new realities, new systems. You're talking about big finance, long-term plans, big agendas coming in saying, wow, we can do that with populations.
Yeah.
You remember that whole stuff we wanted to do to green the planet, to green the civilization of that? Yeah, it's like...
So it was hijacked in a certain sense. The hysterical, albeit justifiable, understandable hysterical response at the beginning when they saw what they could do. And in fact, they actually... someone said that...
Someone articulated...
Someone in the British government said that they were shocked. It might have even been Boris Johnson or someone like that said that they were very surprised
at the uptake in
that people would do
obedience.
What they told them to do. And then they went, hang on a minute, we can use this for a different purpose. The problem is that other purpose would not fly with the population. They would not accept these lockdowns and social distancing, etc., to green the planet or to convert to green the economy. But they will accept it if they're continuing to be told that there's a deadly pandemic that's a danger to their lives. So at this point, that's the objective analysis on the whole situation.
Yeah.
That's as far as you can go. That's the objective take on what's actually going on and why it's going on and why it's continuing to go on. It's not pretty, but it's, we do our best to deal with it and work through it and keep our eye on the ball and, not believe the hype and, try and figure out, try and see through it all. And what's missing for most of the population is I'm not asking people to jump in the crazy conspiracy bandwagon or anything like that or start seeing the world in a radically different way. I think people simply need to do something that is not unreasonable, and it's to have a healthy skepticism for government dictates and things that the media and the government say in unison. To simply question it and don't swallow it wholesale, even or maybe most particularly when it's the kind of messaging that is designed to provoke fear and provoke an emotional response in people. That's when you most need to be skeptical. But unfortunately, that's when it's most difficult for most people to be skeptical, because they're put into a fear kind of fight or flight or state of terror. And it's hard for them to think rationally when they're in that state. But that's when they most need to do it. Yeah. Because that's rationally, that's the most likely time when there's some kind of skulduggery afoot.
Yeah. It's absolutely critical because...
And I'm not saying it is afoot. I'm just saying that's when it's most likely to happen.
Yeah.
You know? Because the government will try and pass things off on the people. If it's ever going to do that, it will try and, get around people and get them to do things that aren't necessarily in their own benefit when they're in a state when they're most compliant. That's when anybody would do something like that. It's an opportunity to do that. I'm not saying they are doing it, but I'm saying that's when you need to pay the most attention and to be most critical of, or think most critically of about the information that you're being given. It's my prediction, for what it's worth, that they are going to wind it down. But I think it'll be over the next few months. But I think the effects by that time of a year of this kind of lockdowns and acclimatizing people to those kind of new social norms, the government has, or the people, the Great Reset people, the World Economic Forum, all that kind of stuff, who have put out this information about wanting to green the economy and change the way people work and change the way people live, for our benefit, right? That they think that year-long period of conditioning of the population to a new normal is sufficient, and that's when they can wrap it up, because they know that it's not going away. And I mean, you've heard people repeatedly say that there's no going back to the old way we did things. They said that almost at the beginning.
Yeah.
This is going to change the world forever. There was a meme being put out there by someone from very early on that this was going to radically change, and people were like, "What the hell are you talking about? This is just a temporary thing. This is just a blip and a bump in the road." And it's like, what are you on crack or something? What are you talking about? But they kept it going long enough, and I think for a lot of people anyway, that period of conditioning will be enough to affect. I think these people that I'm talking about who are pushing this agenda, this greening, climate change preventing agenda, think that they've got enough material now, in a certain sense, of people having been acclimatized to this new normal, that it'll stick.
Yeah.
And then they can wrap it up, but they won't wrap it up fully. They'll keep the messaging going.
Do you think they're right? Do you think most people are on the compliance side with this, even despite the protests and the apparent signs of popular resistance here and there?
Well, one big thing was
people believe.
One big thing was people teleworking, working from home and stuff, and just not being out and about so often. But very much like the Zoom meetings and all that kind of stuff. People not having to go into offices to work and all that kind of stuff. And they're talking about that as well. Of people, basically people, working from home for the rest of their lives. That people who have been doing that for the past 6, 7, 8 months, or whatever, that just keep doing that. And that could be a sizable percentage of the population. And for a lot of people, it's appealing. Don't have to go to the office, whatever, I don't think it's a good move, but that could be one agenda or one aim that will have been achieved by this, that you'll have a significant percentage of the workforce will no longer be going to work. Who knows?
We're a social species. Most of us cannot live like that.
Yeah. Well, we're going to find out, It's all speculative, obviously, at this point, and we'll see how it goes. But, I mean, I'm hearing rumours in cyberspace, murmurs in the Twitter sphere.
From your insiders, Joe?
From my inside sources.
From your inside... What is it, your book?
My big book of inside information. That's where I get all my...
Fantastic.
All my inside information. And, that'll be wound up in the next few months, to some extent. To a large extent. But some things will stay.
Hopefully.
if not if only the mentality. In a certain sense, they hope to keep the mentality among the population. And of course, now that people have got used to lockdowns and know what it's all about, you just have to say the word lockdown. The government just has to say the word lockdown in the future, and boom, everybody knows what to do.
Can't stop the signal, Mel.